Well, joining us now is Frederika Roberts, who's a happiness and resilience specialist and educator, known as the happiness speaker and former secondary school teacher. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Frederika. Can I ask you that first question? How do you define happiness?
There are lots of definitions, but I think the way that it's looked at in the report is particularly looking at overall life evaluation, satisfaction. So how satisfied are you with your life? And that doesn't mean that everything's going to be rosy and wonderful all the time, but it's whether you actually feel overall a sense of satisfaction with how you're living your life, where you are, what's happening with your career, your family, your surroundings, the country you live in, and all of that stuff. And you've touched on a few things there in terms of the social support structures, welfare, whether we live with other people, how we interact, what our perceptions are of the generosity and kindness of other people, for example.
That thing really struck me about our perceptions of the generosity and kindness of other people, because there was a report a few months ago that showed that in terms of face-to-face crime, it's really low. It's much lower than people think it is. There is an increase in crime, but it's mostly cyber fraud and, things that take place online.
Yeah.
And most people said that they felt that their street was relatively safe, but they had this perception that all of the other streets, there was all of this violent criminality going on because of what they were seeing on social media.
Yeah.
So do you think that the fact that social media is out there to shock us, that all of this content that we're seeing, which shows people in such an unfavorable light, is leading to a kind of misperception of how kind the average person is, and that's affecting our happiness?
I think there is definitely an element of that, because we are constantly bombarded by news, whether it's social media, whether it's alerts on our phone. We can hear everything that's going on, read about it, and it can be in the next street, it can be in the next town, it can be in a different country, but we have this constant stream of information about things that are, whether it's violence, whether it's crime, whether it's even just the state of world politics that's happening. So, and that doesn't mean that these things aren't happening or that we should ignore them. But when people keep saying, oh, well, when I was a child, the world was so much safer, it wasn't. It wasn't. I remember being told, I'm in my 50s, and I remember being told to not talk to strangers and don't get into strangers' cars and don't take sweets from strangers. That was always there, but we weren't bombarded by the news at the time. What you were saying there about, well, my street is safe, but, the street next to me, that I've read, I've heard, that really symbolizes it. So we shouldn't ignore when these things are happening, and you've been having some very interesting conversations this evening about violence and radicalization, etc. But by the same token, we should be careful what we feed ourselves in terms of what we consume about those news. And there are some really great, if anybody wants to just put into whatever search engine they use, just Positive News UK, you can find so many sites that are just dedicated to sharing positive news, to just rebalance that perception a little bit. Because whilst there can be major things going on politically, for example, that can upset us, we also know from the research that generally the vast majority of people are actually decent and kind and caring. And therefore, if we rebalance that overall perception and remind ourselves that actually the average person that we're going to meet in the street is probably going to be quite decent and care. And even the people that we might really disagree with politically hugely, if we actually had a one-on-one conversation with them a lot of the time about the reasons why they might hold certain views, and why they might have been radicalized, or why they might have voted for an extremist party, for example, then at the heart of that is probably going to be a perception of not feeling safe, of feeling that they are not in a good place and that people don't care. So if we start having more of those conversations, I think that would really help.
What do you think these Scandinavian countries are getting right that we're not in the UK?
Well, it's interesting because they're not the most sociable people, really, when you talk to Scandinavians about the way they interact with each other. But what they do have, actually, is in most cases they pay an awful lot more taxes,
right?
And there is a lot more welfare support there. And if you look actually at the report, it's interesting that if you compare Finland to the UK in terms of generosity and donations to charity, for example, we give a lot more in the UK. But why do we give more? Because we need to. Because we have hospitals hospitals that need to have charities associated with them in order to function, because we need to give to refugee charities or whatever matters to us, whether it's women's support, etc. So I think that's one of the major differences. If you have a system where people feel, well, actually, I am giving because I pay a lot more taxes if I can afford to support other people, then they're not going to give quite as much to charity because there isn't that need there for that. And I think that's one of the major differences in terms of having that support structure. If people come onto hard times, then there is something there to catch them. And knowing that that is there will also help other people feel happier, because they know that if somebody they care about was to need it, then that would be there. If it happened to them, it would be there. And they know that they're doing something good then by contributing to that.
I have a theory I want to try out on you. So I know that the US is also plummeting down the happiness index, and it's hardly surprising given everything that's going on there at the moment. But my theory has always been that British people have adopted American neoliberalism, but we don't have American optimism. And for that reason, that's why we'd probably be less happy than them. Do you think there's something in that?
There is definitely, and I'm glad you've brought that up actually, because I looked as well at the rates of positive emotions and negative emotions comparing Finland to the UK, for example. And actually there wasn't that much difference in the positive emotions, but there was a huge difference in the negative emotions. So in the UK, we might be quite good at actually experiencing the positive emotions, but what we are very good at is to actually really capitalize on the negative ones, and therefore having that pessimistic outlook. And I do training on well-being in schools and other organizations, you know, in the UK and also in other countries. And it is interesting when you see that difference in terms of, for example, asking people to talk about their own strengths. If you were to do that in the US, people wouldn't have any difficulty telling you about their strengths. You do it in the UK and they're, oh, I'm not very good at this, I'm not very good at that. And but I'm not asking you about what you're not good at. I'm asking you what your strengths are. But what they are very good at is saying, oh, you next to me, you're really good at this and you have this strength. So we are self-deprecating, we are quite pessimistic, and we really capitalize on bad news and negative emotions, and that's not a great combination for happiness. Again, rebalancing that with reading more positive news, with doing things that make us feel good to lift our positive emotions is really important.
In terms of chicken and egg, so if everybody decided to amend their attitude or try and chase more optimism and do all the things that you've suggested, do you think that would be the thing that would push us up the happiness index? Or do you think that actually we need structural changes first, like, for example, spending more on welfare, ensuring that people are not as affected as they are by the cost of living crisis, and then that will in turn affect people's attitudes?
That is an interesting chicken and egg question. Cheating on that question, I will say obviously we need both. But I think if we were more optimistic, we may be more likely to get those changes, because if we're more optimistic, then we're more likely to campaign for changes. We might talk to our MPs more about what we want to see and send that message that, do you know what, I don't want division politics from my MP. I want you to be somebody who stands up for the underdog. I want you to be somebody who campaigns and supports people who need it. And if we started to all say that to our MPs, then maybe what they go for would be slightly different, because, you know, they want to be elected. So if they hear something different to what they think the public wants, then they're going to start acting differently. So I think that optimism would, because if you're not optimistic, then you get into that trap of, well, what's the point?
Yeah,
I can't change anything. Yeah, exactly.
Frederika Roberts, thank you so much. Happiness and resilience specialist and educator, known as the Happiness Speaker and former secondary school teacher there. So a reminder of